For a long time, scientists assumed that human bodies must have been changing constantly, reshaping themselves across the millennia as environments shifted and climates hardened. Yet when we peer into the fossil record from the last 40 to 50,000 years, we find something unnervingly still, as if our species reached a final anatomical form and quietly froze in place while every force of nature continued to move around us. And this strange stillness, this timeless phase, raises the unsettling question of why a creature once shaped by constant pressure suddenly appeared to stop evolving, and what that implies about the deeper currents guiding our history. This story will walk gently through the moment our bodies stabilized after the great bottleneck, explore how tools and culture shielded us from the brutal demands of nature, trace how climate calm, interbreeding, and social complexity softened selection, and reveal the quiet evolutionary whispers still active beneath the skin, all while drifting forward in one continuous thread built to ease the listener toward rest. And as the narrative unfolds, it will show how our stillness was never truly still, how external transformations slowed while internal changes persisted, and how the illusion of a frozen body says more about the world we built than the biology we inherited. The sudden stillness begins with an image that feels almost cinematic. A campfire flickering against a Paleolithic night, its light stroking faces that look strikingly familiar, not in the sense of distant ancestry, but in the sense of passing someone on the street today. Because by around 45,000 years ago, humans in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia shared bodies almost indistinguishable from ours, with the same proportions of limbs, the same rounded cranium, the same narrow pelvis, the same shoulder angles that defined our throwing power, and even the same subtle asymmetries that show up in modern populations, suggesting not the slow drift of ongoing physical evolution, but the final touches of a long sculpting process that had already finished its major work. Mainstream paleoanthropology notes that by the time Homo sapiens dispersed widely across the world, the last big anatomical changes, like reducing brow ridges, lightening skeletal frames, refining jaws, and enlarging the neural vault, had largely stabilized, and important fossil finds from Omokibish, Herto, Skul, Kafse, and early European sites show bodies well within the modern human range, which means that the story of our frozen form begins not recently, but deep in the late Pleistocene, when climate volatility still raged, yet our anatomy no longer shifted to match each new challenge. Important facts from genetic studies also reinforce this calm. Around 70,000 years ago, humanity passed through a severe population bottleneck, most commonly associated with the Toba eruption, though not solely caused by it, reducing genetic diversity so sharply that future generations inherited a narrower range of mutations and physical variants, which, ironically, may have accelerated the stabilization of our appearance, because when fewer lineages remain, fewer divergent physical paths continue. This does not mean evolution stopped. It means it moved differently, more subtly, often hidden from the eye. But in the archaeological record of the next tens of millennia, something quiet but profound becomes clear. As humans spread across deserts, tundra, forests, and islands, their bodies did not diverge into new species or drastically new forms the way earlier hominins did under similar pressures. Real facts from climatic reconstructions show the world they inhabited was chaotic. Glacials, interstadials, megafaunal disappearances, sudden cold snaps like Heinrich events. Yet each shift met not with a new body design, but with new behavior, better tools, richer social webs, and an expanding symbolic world, suggesting that cultural evolution had overtaken biological evolution as the primary survival engine. And so the moment our bodies appeared to stop evolving is not marked by a single threshold, but by an overlapping wave of changes. Improved planning, long-distance trade networks, clothing, tailored shelters, fire mastery, resource sharing, and cooperative care for the vulnerable, all of which insulated the human body from the razor-edged pressures that once forced early hominins to adapt physically or die. The sudden stillness, then, is not a biological silence, but a subtle redirection. Our species shifting from adapting our bodies to mastering the environment with intelligence, technology, and community. A quiet revolution that would anchor the rest of our evolutionary story and set the stage for every chapter to come. The listener may imagine that firelight fading now, the silhouettes unchanged for tens of thousands of years, yet carrying inside them a momentum that has never really stopped, only softened its outward expression as the timeless phase of humanity slowly settled into place. The stillness becomes easier to understand when we return to the razor-thin moment in our deep past when humanity nearly vanished, because after this near-extinction event, often placed around 70,000 years ago, our species emerged not only smaller in number, but more uniform in genetic inheritance, carrying forward a compacted version of our ancient diversity, a narrowed palette of traits that would shape all future bodies and limit the extremes that once splintered earlier hominin species into dramatically different forms. And this new uniformity, born from crisis, set the quiet stage for the frozen traits we see lingering through the late Pleistocene and into the Holocene. The mainstream view points to the Toba supereruption as a major candidate for this bottleneck, though researchers caution that it may have coincided with, rather than solely caused, the drastic human population decline. Yet regardless of its trigger, genetic evidence from mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosomes, and autosomal markers consistently shows that the human population of that era shrank to somewhere between a few thousand and 10,000 breeding individuals, a number so small that many rare physical variants simply disappeared from the evolutionary landscape and never returned. Important facts from paleoanthropology reveal that before this point, hominins displayed astonishing anatomical range. Robust species like Paranthropus with massive jaws built for crushing, archaic humans with thick bones and powerful limbs adapted to harsh environments, and earlier Homo groups with diverse cranial shapes, brow structures, and facial prognathism, all sculpted by strong selective pressures acting on populations that were geographically isolated for hundreds of thousands of years. But after the bottleneck, anatomically modern humans everywhere, whether in Africa, Arabia, or the early migration routes into Eurasia, began converging on a narrow set of shared traits. School and Kafse fossils from around 100 to 80,000 years ago still show some archaic features lingering, such as slightly robust faces or heavier brow arches. Yet by 50,000 years ago, fossils like those at Tianyuan in China or Pestera ku Oase in Europe exhibit nearly all the hallmarks of modern proportions, even when they contain trace Neanderthal ancestry, showing that the core human form had already solidified. Real facts drawn from climate studies further deepen the mystery. During the 70,000 to 40,000 year window, Earth lurched through violent climatic pulses, Heinrich events sending icebergs flooding into the oceans, abrupt droughts sweeping Africa, extreme cold gripping Eurasia. But despite these punishing shifts, the human body, which had evolved dramatically in earlier eras under similar pressures, remained largely unchanged in its external structure. This stability cannot be separated from our growing behavioral complexity. Humans of this era were crafting symbolic ornaments, trading pigments, shaping blades with standardized techniques, building social networks that stretched farther than any primate species before them, and these advances collectively reduced the survival burden placed on sheer physical adaptation, allowing groups to thrive not by altering their bodies, but by altering their behaviors, tools, and cooperative strategies. At the same time, subtle internal evolution quietly continued, even as outward traits plateaued. Researchers note that genes linked to brain development, immunity, skin pigmentation, and metabolic processing still mutated and spread through populations during this era, but these changes did not rearrange the basic blueprint of the human form. Instead, the bottleneck seems to have pruned evolutionary branches, funneled surviving traits into a narrower range, and created a species better equipped to rely on cultural solutions rather than anatomical ones. Some populations did develop localized adaptations, lighter skin tones in higher latitudes for vitamin D absorption, changes in nasal shape related to humidity and cold, and increased endurance traits in desert groups. But even these remained variations within the same overall human frame, never approaching the degree of divergence seen in earlier hominin lineages. As dawn spreads across this chapter in our story, the listener may imagine thousands of small groups scattered across Africa and beyond, not knowing they stand on the other side of a population bottleneck that almost erased them, their campfires flickering in the cold winds of a climate swinging wildly between warmth and chill. And yet those faces, so familiar to ours, bear the early signature of the timeless phase, the moment when humanity emerged from danger, carrying a narrower set of traits that would endure without major outward change for tens of thousands of years. The great bottleneck did not freeze evolution, but it set its boundaries, sculpting a biological framework within which all future humans would unfold, a quiet constraint birthed in catastrophe that allowed the rest of our story to drift forward with a surprising steadiness. When we step gently into the era after the bottleneck, something striking unfolds. While the human body settles into familiar proportions, another part of us, our brain, continues evolving with a restless momentum, as though the physical form reached a quiet plateau while the mind surged forward, refining neural circuits and cognitive capacities long after our anatomy stopped shifting in dramatic ways, creating a unique evolutionary split where the internal world kept changing even as the external one appeared still. Mainstream paleoanthropology shows that the major expansion of our brain size happened earlier, between about 2 million and 300,000 years ago, rising from roughly 600 cubic centimeters in early Homo species to an astonishing 1 to 400 cubic centimeters in modern Homo sapiens. Yet what matters in this chapter is not the raw size, but the subtle rewiring that continued well into the late Pleistocene, shaping memory, planning, symbolic thought, and social cognition even while our physical traits stabilized. Important findings from endocast studies, internal molds of fossil skulls, indicate that the parietal lobe and cerebellum underwent significant reorganization in Homo sapiens after 300,000 years ago, enhancing visuospatial reasoning, tool refinement, and balance control, traits that gave early humans a cognitive edge, even when their outward bodies looked nearly identical to ours by 40 to 50,000 years ago. Archaeological evidence aligns with this neural shift. Around this time, we see the spread of blade technologies, personal ornaments, structured hearths, ritual burials, and long-distance exchange networks, all signs that symbolic capacity, abstract thinking, and temporal planning were strengthening in ways that fossils alone cannot capture. The bodies carrying these expanding minds, slender limbs, reduced brow ridges, flatter faces, had already settled into the timeless phase, but the brains inside them continued to quietly innovate. Real genetic data deepens the story further, revealing signs of positive selection on genes linked to neural development, synaptic plasticity, and language pathways within the last 50,000 years, including variants of FOXP2, microcephalin, ASPM, and others tied to fine motor control and communication, suggesting that cognitive evolution remained active long after major anatomical evolution slowed. This helps explain a key mystery: why humans of the Upper Paleolithic, physically the same as us, suddenly produced bursts of artistic expression like the Chauvet paintings around 37,000 years ago, carved figurines such as the Lovenmensch Lion Man, advanced bone tools, and complex musical instruments. Their bodies had not changed, but their minds had crossed a threshold of symbolic fluency and imaginative depth. This contrast, stable form, dynamic mind, also illustrates why external evolution decelerated while internal evolution maintained a steady rhythm. As humans developed more sophisticated cognition, they relied increasingly on planning and foresight rather than raw physical adaptation. A mind capable of imagining future dangers, coordinating group strategies, and designing tools reduced the need for bodies to morph in response to the environment. Earlier hominins had to let selection sculpt their limbs, jaws, and muscles. Homo sapiens could sculpt solutions in their minds instead. And as mental plasticity grew, so too did cultural complexity. Stories passed between generations, knowledge accumulated rather than vanished, and groups developed specialized roles, all of which buffered individuals from the environmental shocks that once demanded anatomical change. Specific data from environmental reconstructions shows that even as the world entered colder phases like marine isotope stage 3, humans adapted through clothing, shelters, hunting strategies, and fire rather than thicker bones or larger sinuses, indicating that the mind and culture were now carrying the evolutionary load. Even adaptations that did occur, for example, variation in lactose tolerance in pastoralist groups or altitude adaptations in Tibetan populations, represent biochemical and physiological shifts rather than large-scale anatomical redesign. The timeless phase, therefore, is not defined by an absence of evolution, but by the redistribution of evolutionary pressure. The body becomes a steady vessel, while the nervous system becomes a workshop of innovation. Listeners might picture the early creators of the cave paintings kneeling by the flickering glow of torches as they mixed pigments of charcoal, ochre, and manganese, their hands steady, their breath calm, their silhouettes indistinguishable from ours. Yet inside their skulls, an orchestra of neural refinements was unfolding. More nuanced memory pathways, richer social understanding, greater symbolic imagination, quiet changes that would reverberate through millennia while their bodies remained consistent. As human beings stepped deeper into this cognitive renaissance, physical evolution no longer needed to crash forward. Instead, the brain took the lead, becoming the primary arena where adaptation played out, leaving the outward form timeless by comparison. Thus, the reason our bodies appear frozen while our minds kept climbing is not a paradox but a clue. Once intelligence could reshape our surroundings faster than nature could reshape our bones, anatomical evolution eased into a gentle drift, and the great momentum of human change shifted inward, toward memory, language, innovation, and imagination, laying the foundation for everything we would later become. As we drift into the calmer chapters of Earth's recent past, a new force begins to cradle the human body in an unusual stillness, because when the wild climate oscillations of the Ice Age finally gave way to the gentler stability of the Holocene, starting around 11,700 years ago, the environmental pressures that once carved our species into new shapes suddenly softened, and with them softened the need for the human body to adapt visibly, marking another deep layer of the timeless phase in which our outward form remained anchored while the world around us settled into a steady breath. Mainstream paleoclimatology confirms that before the Holocene, Earth swung violently between glacial and interglacial states, sometimes shifting temperature by 10 degrees Celsius in only a few decades, a volatility that once demanded extreme physical resilience from earlier hominins. But once the Holocene dawned, global temperatures stabilized within a narrow band, summer and winter patterns steadied, and ecosystems reorganized into predictable, relatively stable regional climates, creating a world where humanity no longer faced the same brutal natural selection that once sculpted bone, muscle, and physiology. Important archaeological facts show that this stabilizing climate coincides with a profound cultural expansion. Farming emerges in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 years ago. Complex fishing networks develop along the coasts of Japan, early herding traditions arise in North Africa, and permanent settlements unfurl across the Levant, China, Mesoamerica, and the Indus Valley. These shifts, rooted in the new reliability of weather patterns, meant that human groups no longer needed bodies tuned for constant mobility or rapid adaptation. Instead, they needed endurance for repetitive labor, dexterity for tool-making, and social cohesion for managing food stores and seasonal planning, none of which required sweeping anatomical change. Real skeletal data from early agricultural populations shows that while humans developed slightly lighter bones due to decreased mobility and changed workloads, the foundational structure of the human frame remained unchanged. The same upright posture, the same cranial shape, the same limb proportions recognizable from fossils tens of thousands of years older. Climate reconstructions also reveal how river systems stabilized, rainfall patterns became more predictable, and coastal ecosystems shifted slowly rather than violently, allowing communities to thrive in one location for generations. And when a group stays in one ecological niche for long periods with reliable food, predictable seasons, and cooperative living, natural selection targeting the body's shape weakens even more. For earlier hominins who lived through the wild Pleistocene variability, biological evolution served as a constant shield, but Holocene humans increasingly used ingenuity instead, irrigation channels instead of heat-resistant physiology, granaries instead of famine-resistant metabolisms, woven fabrics instead of cold-weather skin adaptations, each innovation making the need for anatomical change smaller. Specific examples show this shift clearly. At Catalhoyuk, one of the earliest large settlements, bodies recovered from burial sites between 7400 and 6200 BCE show the same general skeletal proportions and cranial features as modern populations. In early Chinese Neolithic villages like Jiahu or Peiligang, individuals exhibit the same modern facial structure despite transitioning to agriculture and sedentary lifestyles. And in early Andean communities, even those living at moderate elevations display little anatomical divergence from other populations, suggesting that environmental pressures were often mitigated by cultural strategies like terracing, food storage, and social labor systems. These findings reinforce the real fact that the body's frozen appearance is not an illusion, but the natural consequence of humanity insulating itself from the harsh penalties of nature. Yet even within this stability, subtle changes unfolded, not in the large architecture of the skeleton, but in microevolutionary pathways like digestion, immunity, and metabolism. For example, the spread of lactase persistence after the domestication of cattle around 8,000 years ago shows that evolution continued, but it acted on internal systems rather than altering our general frame. Similarly, the rise of amylase gene copies in grain-based societies improved starch digestion without reshaping jaws or facial bones. And high-altitude adaptations among Tibetan and Andean groups illustrate how genetic shifts could occur in response to extreme environments, yet these shifts remained physiological rather than anatomical, preserving the broader structure of the human body across continents. As we follow this gentle thread, it becomes clear that climate calm created a buffer. Once natural forces no longer pushed our bodies with constant brutality, the rate of outward evolution slowed even more sharply. The listener may imagine early Holocene fields, green barley waving under soft winds, communities storing grain for winter, families weaving baskets or shaping clay pots. And in this predictable rhythm of life, human bodies drift through generations without the dramatic transformations that once marked our lineage. The timeless phase becomes not merely a biological phenomenon, but a cultural one. A species learning to rely less on the body's ability to change and more on the mind's ability to adapt the world around it. And so, as the Holocene unfolded, the human form entered a deeper rest, a quiet anchoring supported by climate stability, technological ingenuity, and the softening of natural selection, allowing our species to step into a new mode of existence, one in which our bodies remain steady even as our behaviors, societies, and civilizations transformed at accelerating speeds. When we drift softly into the next layer of the timeless phase, we reach one of the most decisive turning points in human evolution. The moment tools began replacing muscles, because once humans no longer needed bodies engineered to meet every harsh demand of the natural world, technology quietly stepped in and carried the burden instead, reshaping the very rhythm of evolution and slowing the anatomical changes that had defined earlier hominin species for millions of years. Mainstream archaeological records show that by the time Homo sapiens refined blade industries, pressure flaking, bone needles, compound hafting, fishing gear, projectile points, and later agricultural tools, survival no longer depended on having stronger jaws, thicker rib cages, or heavier limbs. Instead, it depended on skill, coordination, memory, planning, and the ability to cooperate in ways that earlier humans never could have imagined. And this shift, from physical adaptation to technological mediation, became one of the quietest yet most profound reasons our bodies appear to have frozen in time. Important facts come from examining earlier hominin evolution. Australopithecines relied heavily on physical traits to survive: robust jaws for processing fibrous foods, curved fingers for climbing, thick bones for absorbing trauma, and different pelvic structures for varying locomotion patterns. Early Homo species likewise needed strong bodies for endurance hunting and raw meat processing. For them, muscles were survival tools. But for Homo sapiens, especially after around 70 to 50,000 years ago, tools became the new muscles, allowing weaker individuals, older adults, and even children to participate meaningfully in group survival without requiring evolutionary specialization. The appearance of bone awls, fishing hooks, barbed points, and later sickles demonstrates that technology was now doing the heavy lifting, literally and figuratively. Real data from biomechanical analyses shows that the earliest Homo sapiens skeletons, those from sites like Omo, Herto, and later Upper Paleolithic Europe, already exhibit lighter frames compared to Neanderthals, whose massive rib cages, thick femurs, and muscular attachments reflect a life built on the demand for raw physical endurance. Yet, Homo sapiens, living alongside harsh climates and predators, survived not by evolving similar strength, but by developing better tools, projectile weapons to strike from a distance, sewing needles to craft insulating clothing, and traps that leveraged physics rather than muscles. This shift meant that natural selection targeting brute strength diminished. Individuals with injuries, weaker builds, or less robust frames could still contribute and reproduce, diluting pressures that once sculpted anatomy with unforgiving clarity. More specific scientific findings show that as tools grew more sophisticated, selective pressures moved inside the mind and away from the body. Fine motor control improved, requiring neural refinement rather than skeletal change. Cultural learning intensified, rewarding memory and communication over sheer strength, and long-term planning became essential, especially during seasonal hunting and resource gathering, which favored cognitive flexibility rather than muscle-based adaptation. In essence, the more humans engineered solutions outside their bodies, the less the body itself needed to evolve. At the dawn of agriculture around 10,000 years ago, this trend deepened further. Stone sickles replaced the need for powerful foraging grips. Grinding stones replaced heavy jaw musculature, once necessary for processing tough foods. Plows replaced the need for raw limb strength. Nets made fishing accessible to groups without requiring the lung capacity or endurance once needed for free diving or spearfishing. And because these tools democratized survival across different body types, evolution no longer weeded out individuals with less favorable physical traits the way it once had. Even earlier evidence demonstrates this transition clearly. The earliest bow and arrow systems, appearing in Africa more than 60,000 years ago, allowed humans to hunt game at distances unimaginable for earlier hominins who relied on thrusting spears. A weaker hunter with good aim became as valuable as the strongest hunter with brute force. And once a society's survival rested more on skill and cooperation than on anatomy, evolution shifted gears. Instead of selecting for stronger bones or sharper teeth, it selected for social intelligence, language fluency, and cultural transmission. Traits that leave no mark on the skeleton, but transformed humanity profoundly. Real anthropological studies also reveal that as tool dependency increased, bone robusticity decreased. Early agricultural populations show reduced femur thickness, smaller overall muscle attachments, and narrower upper limbs, not because humans became less evolved, but because the environment stopped demanding the heavy anatomy of their ancestors. Evolution favors efficiency. What is not needed is not maintained. And once tools carried our burdens, the body grew lighter, not because evolution stopped, but because it no longer needed to push outward change. Imagine now a small prehistoric camp, its quiet rhythms illuminated by firelight. Someone scraping a hide with a stone scraper, another carving a new spearhead, a group shaping arrow shafts, a child learning by watching. None of them need bodies radically different from yours. None require thicker bones or ape-like forearms or massive jaws. Their tools, not their anatomy, are shaping their future. This is the moment the timeless phase deepens, not because evolution falls silent, but because the external pressures that once carved our form now flow into technology instead. And so the human body, protected by behavior, lifted by invention, and supported by shared knowledge, stops needing to evolve at the visible scale, settling instead into the familiar silhouette we recognize today, while the true evolution continues quietly within the mind, culture, and collective memory of our species. As we travel deeper into the quiet unfolding of the timeless phase, another force rises gently beneath the surface of human history, one far less dramatic than fire or warfare, yet astonishingly powerful in shaping the stability of our physical form. And that is the moment diet diversified through cooking, agriculture, and food processing. Because once humans no longer relied on the harsh selective pressures tied to raw, unprocessed foods, our physiology slipped into a calmer rhythm. and the engines of body-shaping evolution slowed so noticeably that our outward appearance began drifting within a narrow, familiar range for thousands of years. Mainstream anthropology shows that one of the most transformative shifts occurred not with spears or settlements, but with the widespread adoption of cooking more than 400,000 years ago and agriculture roughly 10,000 years ago, both of which softened the demands placed on our jaws, digestive systems, metabolism, and skeletal structure. And this new reliability in nutrition, combined with the ability to physically alter food, reduced the need for large-scale anatomical adaptation, guiding us steadily into the phase where the human body appeared to stop evolving. Important facts from dental anthropology show that before the mastery of cooking, hominins possessed far more robust chewing muscles, thicker mandibles, and larger molars designed to process raw plants, tendons, gristle, and fibrous roots. But by the time Homo sapiens entered the late Pleistocene, these heavy-duty configurations had dramatically reduced, suggesting that softer diets were already shaping a lighter, more gracile face long before agriculture. Yet, after the development of consistent cooking traditions, even this reduction stabilized, and the jaw reached a relatively uniform profile that appears again and again in fossils from Europe, Africa, and Asia. Real skeletal evidence supports this. The Jebel Sahaba remains from around 13,000 years ago, the Natufian hunter-gatherers of the Levant, and early Neolithic farmers across the globe all exhibit the same essential craniofacial structure, despite living in very different ecological conditions. More specific scientific findings reveal that agriculture triggered another profound but subtle shift in human evolution. While bodies did not change dramatically on the outside, internal physiological adaptations began diversifying as different populations specialized in new food systems. For instance, genetic variants allowing adults to digest lactose spread in pastoralist societies of Northern Europe, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East. Yet these did not reshape the skeleton, only the enzyme pathways. Similarly, populations that transitioned to rice or millet agriculture developed metabolic adaptations that improved starch processing, including increases in AMY1 gene copy numbers, but again, without altering the basic proportions of the human jaw or body. Andean groups living with a maize-heavy diet developed unique metabolic responses to handle low-protein intake, while Arctic populations relying on marine fats developed genetic shifts in lipid processing. Yet, all of these changes remained biochemical rather than anatomical. Real archaeological data also reveals the remarkable consistency of the human skeleton across dietary revolutions. Early farmers at Çatalhöyük, who consumed cultivated grains and domesticated animals, show the same general body plan as earlier hunter-gatherers, though sometimes with lighter bones due to reduced mobility. The early Yangshao farmers in China, specializing in millet, share nearly identical facial measurements with later agriculturalists thousands of years apart. Even in Mesoamerica, where maize cultivation transformed entire ecosystems, the bodies of early farmers at sites like Gila Nakwitz or Tlatilco follow the same foundational human template established tens of millennia earlier. The mystery deepens when we consider that drastic dietary transitions elsewhere in nature often produce visible evolutionary responses. Beak changes in Darwin's finches, jaw specialization in carnivores, gut length evolution in herbivores. Yet in humans, the spread of farming brought massive lifestyle changes without major anatomical shifts. The reason becomes clear. Cultural buffering, once again, reduced the evolutionary stress that once demanded physical transformation. Grinding stones softened grains. Fermentation made plants more digestible. Cooking neutralized toxins in tubers, stone mortars, and later metal tools eliminated the need for extremely strong chewing muscles. Storage systems provided calories during droughts, reducing starvation-driven selection. And because food stability increased, the brutal sieves of famine and scarcity no longer shaped our physiology with the same ferocity they once did. Listeners may picture early Neolithic villages, smoke curling gently from earthen ovens, clay pots steaming with cooked grains, children learning to shape dough while adults tend small herds. And in these ordinary scenes lies an extraordinary evolutionary truth. Once humans controlled their food through technology, Biology took a softer tone. Evolution continued, but it moved inward, refining digestion, immunity, and metabolism while leaving the silhouette of the human frame almost unchanged. Even tooth crowding, common in modern humans and often attributed to the softer agricultural diet, does not represent a new anatomical structure, but merely a relaxed selective environment, one in which jaw size no longer needed to stay large enough to accommodate all teeth perfectly. And so, the timeless phase strengthens not because evolution ceased, but because the forces shaping our bodies shifted from natural pressure to cultural innovation. As diet diversified and food became easier to process, the body's ancient need to morph faded into a gentle drift. The bones stayed the same, the silhouette stayed the same, the face stayed familiar. And beneath this stillness, new adaptations whispered through our genes, subtle and quiet, marking the next chapter of the human story. As we move softly into the next quiet layer of the timeless phase, another powerful but gentle force reveals itself. The great migration equalizer, the immense wave of human movement across continents that slowly blended once isolated populations, smoothing out extreme regional adaptations and creating a species whose bodies remained stable in shape even as they spread into every climate on Earth. Because once gene flow increased between distant groups, the possibility of developing drastically different anatomical forms, like earlier hominin species had, faded into the slow, uniform drift we now recognize as the hallmark of modern humanity. Mainstream genetic research shows that between roughly 60,000 and 12,000 years ago, humans swept across Africa, Eurasia, Australia, and eventually the Americas in a series of journeys so vast and interconnected that no earlier hominin had matched them. And at every stage of these migrations, populations mixed, interbred, exchanged traits, and prevented the long-term isolation required for dramatic physical divergence. Important facts from population genetics reveal that earlier hominins such as Homo erectus, Neanderthals, and Denisovans could develop highly specialized bodies, thicker bones, larger sinuses, stockier frames, or unique cranial shapes because their populations remained isolated for hundreds of thousands of years, evolving in separate environments without mixing back into one another. But anatomically modern humans, once they left Africa, spread rapidly and continuously, often looping back into previously settled regions, creating what researchers call reticulate evolution, a branching and rejoining pattern that made extreme anatomical divergence nearly impossible. The Out of Africa model shows that migrations occurred in pulses, movement into the Arabian Peninsula around 70,000 years ago, into India and Southeast Asia shortly after, into Australia by 65,000 years ago, into Europe around 45,000 years ago, and across Beringia into the Americas by at least 15,000 to 14,000 years ago. Each pulse brought people into contact with others, widening the genetic pool. Real genetic evidence strengthens this point even further. Ancient DNA from sites like Ust-Ishim in Siberia, 45,000 years old, Kostenki in Russia, 37,000 years old, and Dolny Vestanets in Czechia, 30,000 years old, shows that even early Eurasian populations were already mixtures of multiple ancestral lineages. The famous Malta boy from Siberia, dating to about 24,000 years ago, carries ancestry shared with both ancient Europeans and early indigenous American populations, illustrating how wide-ranging gene flow had become. Meanwhile, African populations, traditionally the most genetically diverse on Earth, experienced waves of back migration from the Near East and Eurasia, blending lineages even further. This continual mixture ensured that humans everywhere remained variations of a shared anatomical blueprint rather than splitting into region-specific forms. Specific evolutionary examples show how this equalizer functioned. Neanderthals had adapted to the cold with wide rib cages, short limbs, and large nasal cavities, while Homo sapiens entering Eurasia did not evolve these traits despite experiencing similar climates. Instead, they interbred with Neanderthals briefly, gained small genetic contributions, such as variants linked to immunity or keratin production, but retained their own lighter, more gracile anatomy. The reason is simple. Homo sapiens populations never remained isolated in a single environment long enough for such extreme adaptations to fix. People moved, people met, people blended. Each migration wave diluted or prevented new regional specializations. Real anthropological data from early North African, Levantine, and European remains provides further clarity. The Taforalt individuals in Morocco, dating to 15,000 years ago, show ancestry linking them both to sub-Saharan groups and Near Eastern populations. Meanwhile, early Natufians in the Levant share genetic ties with North Africans and later with the first farmers of Anatolia. Even in the deep past, movement erased boundaries before they could harden into separate forms. And by the time farming spread across Europe from Anatolia about 8,500 years ago, the continent experienced another massive wave of gene flow, mixing local hunter-gatherers with newcomers and later with steppe pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian region, all without producing distinct new anatomical types. The physiological impact of this mixing becomes even clearer when we examine how modern human variation remains continuous rather than categorical. Skin color gradients follow latitude and ultraviolet exposure, not strict population divides. Nose shapes reflect humidity and climate variables, but fall within overlapping ranges across continents. Stature varies with nutrition, mobility, and historical living conditions. None of these variations approach the specialized extremes found in earlier hominians, because migration constantly smoothed differences, pulling populations back toward a shared center of anatomical stability. Put simply, the human body did not stop evolving, it stopped diverging. The listener may imagine people walking across ancient landscapes, small groups traveling along coastlines, following river valleys, moving through mountain passes, crossing deserts under starlit skies. Each encounter, each shared fire, each exchanged tool, each intermarried family, blended biological legacies that once would have drifted apart. When mobility is constant and communities trade mates, ideas, and technologies, natural selection loses the long, uninterrupted time spans necessary to sculpt drastically different forms. The timeless phase deepens here not because evolution paused, but because connection replaced isolation. Real-world numbers illuminate this beautifully. Many regional traits, such as adaptations to extreme cold or high altitude, did emerge, but they remained subtle. The Inuit developed shorter limbs and unique fat metabolism within the last 5,000 years. Tibetans evolved EPAS-1 variants from Denisovan ancestry. Andeans developed increased hemoglobin concentrations. Yet none of these resulted in new species, new body plans, or even changes comparable to those that separated Neanderthals from earlier Homo species. That is because gene flow continually balanced localized pressures. The more humans moved, the more evolution avoided branching into divergent forms. Thus, the migration equalizer acts like a quiet, steady tide washing over the evolutionary landscape, softening sharp edges, blending distant lineages, and ensuring the human frame remains anchored across continents. The timeless phase becomes not simply a product of cultural innovation or climate calm, but a consequence of movement itself, the great wandering that knitted humanity together long before cities or civilizations emerged. And as these migrations continued, our species carried forward a unified body into every corner of the world, shaping the stable, familiar silhouette we recognize today. As the timeless phase deepens, another gentle but transformative force settles over humanity. The rise of cooperative living, a profound social shift that replaced many of the harsh Darwinian pressures once sculpting our physical form. Because when survival began, depending more on group support than on individual strength or speed, the human body no longer needed to evolve dramatic new features to keep pace with a dangerous world, and evolution instead flowed into behaviors, minds, and social bonds rather than bones or muscles. Mainstream anthropology tells us that cooperation is not a recent invention. It has roots stretching into the earliest Homo species. But something changed when Homo sapiens expanded across the world. Cooperation became more intricate, layered, structured, and emotionally rich, evolving into networks of care that allowed individuals who would not have survived in earlier eras to live long enough to contribute, reproduce, and pass on genes that might have once been eliminated by natural selection. Important archaeological evidence illustrates this shift through the remains of individuals who lived despite severe injuries or chronic illnesses. At Shanidar Cave, Neanderthals cared for members with missing limbs and blindness, hinting at early compassion. But in Homo sapiens, communities of the Upper Paleolithic and early Holocene, such cases become far more common, suggesting that cooperative strategies were expanding dramatically. Skeletons from sites like Dolny Vestonis, Sunghir, and the Levant reveal individuals with lifelong disabilities who were clearly supported by their groups. In earlier hominins, such conditions might have prevented survival altogether. But now, every person, strong or weak, fast or slow, was protected by the social fabric. This dramatically reduced selective pressures that once favored strictly advantageous anatomical traits. Real anthropological data further shows that cooperative living reshaped the very rhythm of human survival. For early Homo species 300,000 years ago, survival depended heavily on individual abilities, endurance running, raw strength, foraging expertise, and heightened sensory awareness. But for Homo sapiens in the late Pleistocene and Holocene, survival increasingly depended on group-level traits, division of labor, knowledge sharing, childcare cooperation, food distribution, and long-term alliances between bands. Grandparents, once biologically rare, became common due to improved survival rates, and their presence enhanced knowledge transmission, strengthening group resilience in ways unrelated to physical evolution. Specific examples highlight how cooperation cushioned humanity from the selective pressures once driving anatomical change. When food was scarce, groups shared resources, which prevented famine-driven evolutionary bottlenecks. When predators lurked, communal defense and tool-based hunting reduced the need for stronger bodies. When illnesses spread, group care increased survival odds for the vulnerable. And when children were numerous, cooperative childcare allowed mothers to wean earlier, increasing population growth without requiring new reproductive adaptations. Each of these changes reduced the selective force acting directly on the human physique. Real demographic models suggest that by the time the first large settlements emerged, around 10,000 years ago in places like Jericho, Göbekli Tepe, and the early Chinese Neolithic, social networks had grown so dense that individuals' physical differences mattered far less than their ability to participate in community life. Skills like tool-making, planning harvest cycles, navigating social norms, and contributing to ritual practices mattered more than raw strength or anatomical efficiency. In such environments, evolution began selecting for traits that improved social cohesion, empathy, communication, memory, emotional regulation, rather than those that altered outward body shape. Even group burial practices reveal the growing importance of social belonging. At sites like Sunghir, lavish burials with beads, mammoth ivory spears, and ornaments were given not only to powerful hunters, but also to children, individuals with disabilities, and those who would not have been physically dominant. This is evolution through culture, not biology. The community determined value, not the body. And cultural value profoundly alters selective pressure. As cooperative webs strengthened, the geography of human life also changed. Instead of roaming constantly in small isolated bands, people formed networks with seasonal gathering places, shared rituals, and exchange systems. These interactions amplified group identity over physical adaptations. Individuals no longer lived or died solely based on climate or terrain. They lived based on relationships, shared knowledge, and collective effort. The human body no longer carried evolution on its shoulders. The human community carried it instead. Listeners may imagine a prehistoric settlement at dusk. Elders sharing stories around a fire, young hunters dividing their catch evenly, children weaving grasses under the gentle guidance of older siblings, travelers bringing news from distant valleys. In scenes like this, strength is no longer the only currency. Cooperation is, knowledge is, memory is, compassion is. These qualities, none of which reshape the bones, begin shaping the destiny of the species more profoundly than any anatomical feature ever could. Real-world examples demonstrate this clearly. Coastal fishing villages relied on coordinated net pulling rather than individual diving skills. Mountain communities used teams to move stones for terracing, Desert groups shared water knowledge, ensuring even the weak survived. Each of these social solutions buffered individuals from selective forces. Evolution became a collective project rather than a solitary one. Thus, the rise of cooperative living becomes one of the great quiet engines behind the timeless phase of human bodies. When survival depends on the collective, the body no longer must perfect itself against the world. The group does the protecting. And once culture, not anatomy, became the main tool of adaptation, the human form settled into its familiar silhouette, a shape carried through time not by physical necessity, but by the deep strength of shared life. And now, as we drift deeper into the quiet heart of the timeless phase, we reach a truth that gently dissolves the illusion that human evolution ever truly stopped. While the outer form of the body stabilized, evolution simply moved inward, flowing into our genes, our biochemistry, and the silent micro-adaptations unfolding beneath the skin. Changes so subtle that the archaeological record cannot display them, yet so persistent that every living human today carries the marks of this invisible evolution. Mainstream genetic research shows that even within the last 10,000 years, a blink in evolutionary time, humans experienced thousands of small genetic shifts affecting immunity, metabolism, disease resistance, temperature regulation, fertility, and even behavioral tendencies, none of which altered the overall shape of the skeleton, but all of which reveal that evolution continued, only hidden from view. Important facts emerging from whole genome sequencing demonstrate that natural selection remained active long after our anatomy reached stability. Studies of ancient DNA show that genes linked to skin pigmentation changed rapidly as humans migrated into higher latitudes, leading to lighter skin in some populations to improve vitamin D synthesis, while others maintained darker pigmentation for protection against ultraviolet radiation. Yet these changes adjusted physiology, not structure. Other genes, like those influencing hair type, sweat glands, or immune responses, diversified across regions, adapting humans to environments as different as the Arctic tundra and the tropical rainforest without reshaping the fundamental architecture of the human frame. Real scientific findings reveal sweeps of positive selection on genes such as SLC24A5 and SLC45A2 for pigmentation, EDAR in East Asia for hair thickness and dental traits, and G6PD variants in malaria endemic regions for resistance to severe infection. None of these genetic shifts change the classic human profile: the forward-facing eyes, the rounded skull, the precise limb proportions that define our species. More striking examples arise from immunity. As humans settled into denser communities and eventually into early agricultural towns, diseases like tuberculosis, cholera, measles, and malaria began exerting strong selective pressures, shaping immune-related genes at extraordinary speed. Individuals with certain variants of HLA genes, CCR5 mutations offering partial resistance to viral infections, or Duffy null alleles conferring immunity to certain malaria strains, gained survival advantages that spread through populations. These evolutionary shifts were rapid, but invisible. A skeleton taken from a plague-surviving lineage looks exactly like one from a plague-succumbing lineage. Outwardly identical, inwardly worlds apart. Specific metabolic changes also whisper through the human timeline. Populations relying heavily on grains developed increased amylase gene copies, improving starch digestion. Those living in cold climates developed enhanced thermogenesis mechanisms. Groups consuming fatty marine diets developed shifts in lipid metabolism. And high-altitude peoples like Tibetans evolved adaptations affecting oxygen processing through EPAS and EGLN1, allowing survival in low-oxygen environments without altering the outward anatomy of the lungs or rib cage. The Andeans, though following a different physiological pathway, exhibit increased oxygen carrying capacity. Again, invisible evolution shaping internal function rather than external form. Real demographic and genetic models show that these micro-adaptations acted on millions of people over thousands of years, accumulating layer by layer, even as the skeleton, muscles, and facial structure changed only within a narrow range. Evolution was not paused, it had merely shifted arenas. Instead of sculpting the silhouette of our species, it now fine-tuned the workings beneath. Immune pathways, hormonal balances, neural chemistry, and subtle physiological efficiencies that influence how we process foods, respond to pathogens, metabolize energy, or handle stress. Even behavioral evolution leaves traces in the genome that are profound, though nonspecific. Genes associated with serotonin transport, dopamine regulation, circadian rhythm, and social bonding show signs of recent selection in certain populations. These do not produce new body shapes. They produce new tendencies toward cooperation, emotional resilience, or adaptation to specific seasonal cycles, traits that do not fossilize but nonetheless mold the trajectory of human societies. And because such traits intertwine with culture, their effects ripple outward into traditions, social structures, and technological creation, contributing to the powerful feedback loop between evolution and behavior. Listeners may imagine a child in a Neolithic village, a mother in an Iron Age settlement, a hunter in the Siberian tundra, a farmer in ancient Anatolia. Their bones nearly identical, their silhouettes interchangeable across continents and millennia. And yet inside them, invisible currents flowed, genetic variations tuned to their diets, climates, disease exposures, and cultural rhythms. Even though their frames look the same in the archaeological record, their bodies processed food differently, fought pathogens differently, regulated stress differently. Each carried invisible adaptations crafted by the slow pressure of their environment, the quiet hum of evolution working not on the shape of the body but on the machinery within. And it is here that the heart of the mystery settles into clarity. The timeless phase of the human body is not proof of evolutionary silence, but proof of evolutionary redirection. Our outward stillness is a mask for inner motion. Natural selection did not vanish. It receded beneath the visible horizon, continuing its work where bone could no longer record it. Evolution continued in the shadows, weaving subtle improvements, refining internal systems, and adjusting the deep biological rhythms of humanity in ways that only modern genetics can reveal. Thus, the timeless phase was never truly timeless. It was merely quiet. A whispering evolution persisted beneath the skin, guiding our species forward in ways small yet profound, shaping the humanity within while preserving the humanity without, ensuring that across tens of thousands of years, the familiar silhouette of our species remained steady even as our inner landscape evolved ceaselessly. As we continue drifting through the quiet corridors of the timeless phase, another powerful and often overlooked force comes into view, one that shaped human evolution long after our anatomy appeared to settle, and one that did so not by sculpting our bones, but by reshaping the internal battleground of survival. And that force is disease, the relentless and invisible architect of human biology, whose pressures redirected evolution inward, acting on immunity, resistance, and biochemical pathways rather than on the external form, allowing our species to maintain a stable outward shape even as natural selection raged within. Mainstream genetic and anthropological studies make it clear. Once humans began living in larger groups, forming villages and domesticating animals, disease became one of the most important selective pressures in our history, a silent sculptor influencing which genes flourished and which faded, all without altering the universal human silhouette preserved across millennia. Important facts from ancient DNA research reveal that pathogens like malaria, tuberculosis, plague, leprosy, and smallpox exerted strong, consistent selective pressures on human populations, accelerating genetic change in ways that had little to do with the structure of our skulls or limbs. For example, the rise of agriculture around 10,000 years ago increased population density, enabling infectious diseases to spread more efficiently. Variants associated with immune system genes, particularly within the HLA region, began sweeping through populations, and mutations like the Duffy null allele in West Africa spread rapidly because they prevented malaria parasites from entering red blood cells, granting powerful survival advantages while leaving the skeleton unchanged. Similarly, the CCR5D32 mutation, which today offers resistance to HIV, shows signs of selection likely tied to historic epidemics such as smallpox or plague. Again, its effects play out on immune pathways invisible in bones. Real epidemiological reconstructions also reveal that zoonotic diseases, Illnesses transmitted from animals to humans became major evolutionary pressures once goats, cattle, pigs, and sheep entered human settlements. Tuberculosis leapt from livestock, influenza descended from waterfowl, measles evolved from cattle pathogens, and each new disease wave tested the human immune system with unrelenting force. Yet, despite these monumental pressures, the body did not evolve thicker bones, larger lungs, or new physical structures. Instead, natural selection favored individuals with stronger innate immunity, more efficient inflammatory responses, or mutations that prevented infection entirely. Evolution adapted our defenses, not our form. More specific examples reveal just how targeted these adaptations were. In malaria endemic regions, the sickle cell trait spread because it provided partial protection against severe malaria, even though it carried health costs when inherited from both parents. In Northern Europe, where vitamin D deficiency posed a threat in low sunlight environments, skin pigmentation lightened through selection on genes like SLC24A5. But again, this adjustment refined physiology, not anatomy. In East Asia, variants in the FADS gene cluster improved the body's ability to process marine fats, a vital adaptation for coastal populations. And in the Andes, high-altitude groups developed changes that improved oxygen utilization. These were microevolutions, powerful, life-saving, but invisible to the archaeologist's eye. Real historical data also connects disease with cultural evolution. The spread of plague during the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods appears to correlate with population turnovers in Europe, suggesting that disease pressures influenced migration patterns and even the replacement of some cultural groups. Yet skeletons from before and after these turnovers remain remarkably similar in outward form. Disease shaped who survived, how they lived, and which genes moved forward, not by reshaping the human body, but by determining whose bodies endured within the existing anatomical framework. Listeners may imagine an ancient settlement at dusk, children chasing each other between mud brick homes, livestock penned nearby, smoke rising from hearths, and unseen in the air, pathogens drifting through the crowded space. In this world, survival no longer depended on muscle mass or limb proportion. It depended on immunity, resilience, and the quiet strength of internal defenses. Those who possessed favorable genetic variants survived epidemics. Those without them often perished. Natural selection continued, merciless and relentless, but it acted on the invisible machinery of the body rather than its visible design. Even the evolution of inflammatory responses reveals this inward shift. Genetic variants that heightened inflammation helped humans survive bacterial infections in pre-modern eras. But in the modern world, these same variants contribute to autoimmune disorders, demonstrating how evolution shaped humanity for a pathogen-laden environment very different from the one we inhabit today. Our bodies bear these evolutionary signatures deep within, in the way we respond to viruses, in how our cells manage oxidative stress, in how our immune systems detect invaders. Yet, none of this changed the outward form that appears so constant across the fossil record. Clouded behind this stillness, the timeline becomes clearer. Evolution never stopped. It simply redirected itself toward the arena where survival mattered most. Disease shaped humanity more powerfully than predators, climate, or competition during the last 10,000 years. It acted faster, more selectively, and across larger populations. But because the immune system operates beneath the surface, its adaptations left no mark on the bones that archaeologists unearthed, giving the impression that nothing changed. Thus, the human body remained familiar. Upright posture, rounded skull, balanced limbs, while evolution worked tirelessly beneath the skin. Our silhouette stabilized, but our biology did not. The quiet truth is that the timeless phase is not an era of evolutionary silence, but an era of internal transformation, where disease became the great sculptor of our species, shaping our destiny in ways too subtle for the fossil record to reveal, but too profound to ignore. As we continue drifting gently through the quiet architecture of the timeless phase, another subtle yet profoundly influential force rises into view, one that shaped humanity not through climate nor tools nor disease, but through the choices individuals made about whom they loved, partnered with, and raised children with. And that is the silent power of sexual selection, a force that continued shaping human traits long after our anatomy looked finished, yet did so in ways soft enough, slow enough, and subtle enough that the fossil record barely whispers its presence. Mainstream evolutionary anthropology emphasizes that human attraction has always been influenced by cultural ideals, resource access, health cues, and signals of cooperation. But in Homo sapiens, sexual selection took on an especially intricate form, creating gentle long-term pressures on facial symmetry, skin clarity, hair distribution, voice pitch, body ratios, and temperament, none of which drastically altered our species' overall silhouette, yet all of which guided evolution quietly through countless generations. Important facts arise when we consider how sexual selection works compared to natural selection. Natural selection responds to external pressures, a harsh climate, a new predator, a dangerous disease. But sexual selection responds to internal pressures, preferences, desires, cultural norms, perceived beauty, and signals of trustworthiness. And because Homo sapiens developed symbolic communication, shared stories, ritual practices, and complex social norms, these preferences did not remain random or fleeting. They persisted. Across thousands of years, consistent patterns repeated themselves, favoring individuals who appeared healthier, calmer, more cooperative, more symmetrical, or more socially skilled. These traits do not fossilize like bones, but they do leave evolutionary signatures in the genome. Real scientific studies show, for example, that facial symmetry is associated with developmental stability and health resilience, leading to slight but persistent selection in favor of more symmetrical features. Yet this does not create new anatomical structures. It refines proportions within the existing human template. Similar pressures may have shaped skin clarity, encouraging genes that reduced chronic inflammation or improved pathogen resistance. Even hair density and distribution, especially the reduced body hair characteristic of humans, continued to vary subtly through sexual selection as populations developed cultural preferences for smoother skin or particular hair textures. Again, these adjustments happen within the stable architectural framework of the body, nudging traits gently rather than reinventing the human form. Specific examples of this can be found in voice pitch, which influences mate choice in many cultures, or in waist-to-hip ratios associated with fertility signals, or in upper body strength preferred in some societies. Each of these contributes to subtle sexual selective pressures that accumulate gradually across generations. Yet none of them push the human body into new evolutionary directions like those that once created archaic humans or earlier hominins. Sexual selection operates not by dramatic leaps, but by soft inclinations, slight statistical biases in who reproduces more successfully. Real anthropological data shows that cultural ideals varied widely across prehistoric societies. Some preferred broader bodies associated with strength and food security. Others preferred slender forms associated with agility or endurance. Some favored particular facial markings, piercings, hairstyles, or ornaments. But because populations continuously interacted, migrated, and exchanged mates, no extreme traits were allowed to drift into full regional specializations as they had in earlier hominin lineages. A subtle preference in one group could be diluted by contact with another. A unique local ideal could dissolve through intermarriage, and thus sexual selection in humans operated like a soft brushstroke rather than a sculptor's chisel. Modern genetic research supports this view. Variants affecting hormone regulation, like those connected to testosterone or estrogen sensitivity, show patterns of mild selection over the past tens of thousands of years. Changes affecting traits like skin tone, hair form, and facial structure often reveal a blend of both natural and sexual selection. For example, lighter skin in some populations may have spread through natural selection for vitamin D production, but sexual selection may have amplified the preference for certain shades. Similarly, the thick straight hair linked to the Idar variant in East Asia may have carried both climate-related and attractiveness-related selective pressures. These complex interactions illuminate how evolution continued in countless subtle ways, even as the skeleton itself remained stable. Listeners may imagine a quiet prehistoric village illuminated by soft firelight, young adults gathering during seasonal festivals, exchanging glances, laughs, small gestures of interest, each carrying preferences shaped by thousands of years of cultural tradition. Some are drawn to expressive eyes, others notice a calm voice or graceful movement, others seek generosity, humor, reliability, or social warmth. These choices, repeated over generation after generation, become evolutionary currents, not violent ones, not rapid ones, but steady and persistent, carving faint patterns into the human lineage. Even temperament and social behaviors reflect this slow pressure. Traits linked to emotional stability, cooperation, and reduced aggression appear to have increased through time, possibly due to both natural and sexual selection, favoring individuals who could navigate complex social environments. In a world where community survival depended on harmony and trust, individuals with volatile or overly aggressive traits may have reproduced less than those who integrated well into group life. These behavioral traits shape cultures, families, and communities, influencing mating patterns and gradually shifting the population's genetic landscape, all without altering the outward skeleton. And here lies the quiet beauty of sexual selection. It does not transform the body in dramatic, fossil-visible ways. It refines, it smooths, it tunes, it gently shapes the subtler parts of humanity, the softness of the face, the clarity of the skin, the cadence of the voice, the calm of the eyes, the warmth of expression. Traits too delicate for bone to record, but powerful enough to guide evolution across ages. Thus, the timeless phase deepened not because evolution paused, but because the forces acting on the body shifted from survival to choice, from external pressures to internal preferences, from nature's demands to humanity's desires. And in this shift, the human form remained steady while the human essence continued evolving quietly, guided by the soft, persistent hand of sexual selection. As we drift even deeper into the gentle architecture of the timeless phase, another subtle force emerges, one that did not act through violence, famine, or climate, but through connection itself. And that force is the age of gene flow, the long epoch in which distant human populations that had once diverged began rejoining, mixing, and blending until the extreme evolutionary branches that had produced earlier hominin diversity smoothed into a single, shared human lineage. Mainstream genetics reveals that for hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens emerged, human evolution unfolded through isolation. Neanderthals in Ice Age Europe, Denisovans in parts of Asia, Homo erectus lingering in Southeast Asia, and smaller, regionally specialized species across the globe. But once Homo sapiens began migrating widely, after about 70,000 years ago, the story shifted, and instead of splitting apart, humankind's genetic streams began weaving together, merging ancient lineages into one interconnected biological tapestry. Important facts from ancient DNA show that this fusion began early. Around 50s into 60,000 years ago, modern humans interbred with Neanderthals as they moved into Eurasia, acquiring between 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA in all non-African populations today. Shortly after, sapiens encountered Denisovans in eastern Eurasia, leaving a more uneven genetic footprint, up to 5 to 6% in Melanesian and Aboriginal Australian populations, lesser amounts in East Asians, and traces in parts of Southeast Asia. Later, back migrations from Eurasia into Africa brought Neanderthal-derived variants into some African populations as well, further dissolving the sharp boundaries that once divided ancient branches of the human family tree. Real data from genome sequencing reveals that African populations today carry the richest genetic diversity on Earth, not because they remained isolated, but because they experienced both ancient continuity and repeated waves of mixing from other groups. More specific discoveries deepen this picture. Fossil remains like those from Pestera cu Oase in Romania, dating to around 40,000 years ago, belong to a modern human with a Neanderthal ancestor only 4 to 6 generations back, proof that gene flow was not a rare accident, but a repeating pattern. Similar findings arise from Denisova Cave, where a bone fragment from a young female reveals that her mother was a Neanderthal and her father a Denisovan, showing that even archaic populations interbred. And early African lineages show signs of ghost populations, ancient hominin groups whose DNA survives in modern genomes despite their fossils remaining undiscovered. Each discovery tells the same story. Evolution in humans did not create separate species as it once did among earlier hominins, because extensive gene flow kept populations connected, blending boundaries before they could crystallize. Real anthropological patterns reinforce this truth. Throughout the late Pleistocene and Holocene, humans moved constantly, across deserts, along coasts, through mountain passes, across frozen land bridges. Hunter-gatherers in Europe traveled vast distances to exchange materials like obsidian and amber. Pastoralists on the Eurasian steppe migrated seasonally, spreading genes and cultural innovations alike. Farmers from the Near East expanded into Europe around 8,500 years ago, mixing with local hunter-gatherers. Then, around 5,000 years ago, populations from the Pontic-Caspian steppe expanded westward and southward, merging again with earlier groups. Each wave added new threads to the fabric of humanity. Each encounter softened regional differences, and each generation carried forward blended ancestries that prevented the rise of new, anatomically distinct human branches. Modern genetic clustering illustrates how thorough this blending became. Instead of forming separate species or even sharply divided subspecies, humans exhibit gradients, slow transitions across geography rather than isolated divergent populations. Traits like height, nose shape, skin tone, and hair form vary across continents, but do so gradually, overlapping across regions, reflecting not long-term isolation, but long-term mixing. And because gene flow moved faster than isolation could settle in, no group remained separate long enough to develop extreme adaptations like those of Neanderthals or Homo floresiensis. Evolution continued, but its palette of variation became shared. Listeners may picture ancient trade routes, caravans traveling through the Levant, boats hugging the coasts of Indonesia, group migrations across the Eurasian steppe. Or imagine a young hunter from one band joining another through marriage, carrying with him not only stories, but genes that once belonged to distant ancestors. Each connection becomes an evolutionary bridge. Each marriage across groups erases a boundary that might have grown into long-term divergence, and each birth blends lineages that had once been separated for millennia. Even after the rise of farming, gene flow only accelerated. Archaeological genomes show that early European farmers carried ancestry from Anatolia, the Caucasus, the Levant, and locally adapted hunter-gatherers. In East Asia, populations mixed across northern and southern regions long before written history. In Africa, pastoralist herders moved genes thousands of miles across the continent, blending lineages that had diverged tens of thousands of years earlier. And in Oceania, Austronesian voyagers brought new ancestry into island populations that had been isolated for thousands of years, further smoothing genetic diversity across the region. The effect of this constant mixing on evolution is profound. Traits that might have specialized in isolation, body shapes, limb proportions, cranial forms, never reached extremes because new genetic variation continuously flowed into each region. The timeless phase is, in part, a story of endless reunion. Humanity did not stay still. Humanity moved, braided itself together, and prevented the deep splits that define earlier evolutionary chapters. And so, evolution did not stop. It became shared. The human species entered an era where genetic boundaries blurred, where population histories intertwined, and where the outward body remained stable not from stagnation, but from connection. In this age of gene flow, humanity became one continuous lineage, shaped not by separation, but by union, carrying forward a shared form through time even as cultures, languages, and civilizations branched outward in infinite directions. And now, as we drift into the later chapters of the timeless phase, another quiet but monumental shift emerges, one that finally reveals why, from an evolutionary standpoint, the human body no longer needed to transform itself in dramatic ways. And that is the moment technology began outrunning biology, reshaping the environment faster than natural selection could operate, shielding us from forces that once acted directly on our bodies and in doing so, turning our physical evolution from a roaring river into a gentle stream. Mainstream evolutionary theory holds that natural selection requires three things: variation, heredity, and differential survival based on environmental pressures. But once humans built tools, shelters, clothing, agriculture, and eventually civilizations, the environment stopped being a strict filter and became instead a space manipulated by the human mind. In this new world, culture evolved far faster than bodies could, and the human form, stable since the Upper Paleolithic, became a vessel carried through time rather than a canvas continually reshaped. Important facts from archaeology and paleoanthropology make this truth clear. Early hominins changed their bodies to survive. Longer legs for endurance hunting, larger brains for problem solving, narrower shoulders for throwing, lighter bones for mobility. But Homo sapiens changed the world around them instead. When cold threatened survival, clothing replaced the need for thicker fur or more insulating body types. When heat scorched the savanna, shelters and water storage replaced the need for new sweat gland densities or altered skin thickness. When predators lurked, stone-tipped weapons replaced the need for sharper claws or stronger teeth. And when food grew scarce, agriculture replaced the need for bodies adapted to famine. In each case, cultural innovation substituted for anatomical adaptation, leaving evolution with fewer external pressures acting directly on the skeleton. Real scientific data reinforces this dramatic inversion of evolutionary roles. Studies of early agricultural societies show that even though lifestyles changed drastically toward more sedentary living, altered diets, new disease exposures, the overall human form remained consistent. Bones became slightly lighter due to reduced mobility, but the underlying architecture never shifted into a new direction. The agricultural revolution introduced massive cultural change, yet skeletal change stayed minimal. Later cultural revolutions, urbanization, metallurgy, written language, long-distance trade, produced even fewer anatomical alterations, demonstrating that the pace of cultural evolution had far outstripped biological evolution. More specific examples illustrate this point with striking clarity. Inuit communities in the Arctic survived with relatively similar physical forms to equatorial populations because culture allowed them to adapt. Seal fat fuel, snow houses, layered clothing, and communal hunting insulated them from the extreme cold. Without these cultural innovations, natural selection might have pushed anatomy toward the extremes seen in earlier cold-adapted hominins, like Neanderthals' robust bodies. Instead, the human body remained stable because human ingenuity replaced biological necessity. Likewise, desert populations thrived with technologies that conserved water, shaded dwellings, and innovative hunting tools, solutions that prevented the need for extreme physiological adaptations to heat. Real genetic findings also underscore how technology weakened the connection between environment and body. For example, the adoption of agriculture produced new evolutionary pressures, like lactose tolerance or starch digestion. But even these adaptations did not alter the skeleton. They were internal, metabolic, and biochemical. Meanwhile, the invention of pottery, bread making, and fermentation further reduced selective pressure on jaws and teeth. The mastery of fire softened food long before agriculture, preventing the need for strong chewing muscles or large jaws. Even walking changed. Paved roads, later horses, and still later wheels reduced the need for the endurance locomotion that once shaped early Homo species. But the most profound change came with the rise of complex societies. Once humans lived in towns, cities, and organized states, natural selection no longer acted directly on individuals through predators or harsh environments. Instead, technology shaped the environment entirely. Irrigation systems turned deserts into farmland. Metal tools increased agricultural output. Trade routes delivered exotic foods. Architectural innovations stabilized temperature, improved safety, and provided shelter from storms. And as these changes accelerated through time, the human body, already stable for tens of thousands of years, experienced even fewer reasons to change. Listeners may imagine a young person walking through a Bronze Age city like Ur or Mohenjo-Daro or Anyang, They stroll down streets with drainage systems, sleep in multi-room homes, eat cooked grains and meats from pottery vessels, and use tools for every task from farming to crafting. Their world is shaped by technology, not anatomy. By this era, the environment acts less like a sculptor and more like clay in human hands. Evolution still hums quietly in the background, refining immune systems, adjusting metabolic pathways. But the body itself remains anchored in the same form carried by Upper Paleolithic ancestors. The later revolutions only amplified this gap. The Iron Age accelerated agriculture. The Classical Age produced engineering marvels. The Industrial Revolution introduced mechanization. The Digital Age reshaped how humans interact with time, labor, and environment. Each leap widened the gap between biological evolution and cultural evolution. And as technology grew exponentially faster, biology remained slow, steady, unchanged in silhouette. In this sense, the timeless phase is not simply a biological mystery, but a technological story. The human body stabilized because culture relieved it from evolutionary burdens. Our ancestors did not need to evolve new lungs for high altitudes. They built dwellings that trapped heat and preserved oxygen. They did not need to evolve heat-resistant skin. They built shade and storage systems. They did not need to evolve thick bones. They built tools and machines that reduced physical strain. Technology became an evolutionary buffer, protecting the body from pressures that once would have reshaped it. Thus, the reason the human body appears unchanged for tens of thousands of years is not that evolution paused, but that culture, and later technology, began evolving so quickly that biology could no longer keep pace. The human form remained steady and familiar, carried forward by the ingenuity that reshaped the world instead of our bones. As we move into the soft contemplative space near the end of the timeless phase, the question naturally arises. If the human form stabilized for tens of thousands of years, what might future evolution look like? And the answer, whispered through genetics, technology, and the shifting rhythms of modern life, reveals a landscape of possibilities, some subtle, some startling, none guaranteed, because the forces shaping our species today differ profoundly from the pressures that sculpted our ancient ancestors. Mainstream evolutionary biology teaches that evolution never truly stops. It only changes direction depending on the pressures acting on a population. And now, in the modern world, those pressures include medicine, global travel, technology, urban life, social structures, and even digital environments, all of which nudge human evolution into new, emerging pathways that remain invisible in our outward anatomy, but may slowly accumulate into meaningful change over generations. Important facts from contemporary genetic studies show that humans are still evolving right now. Research demonstrates that natural selection continues to act on traits such as cholesterol metabolism, immune responses, height variation, fertility rates, and even behavioral tendencies. For example, variants related to lower blood pressure or improved lipid processing have increased in frequency over the last few thousand years. Certain populations show evidence of selection for improved malaria resistance or for high-altitude efficiency beyond the adaptations of earlier eras. Yet, none of these selective pressures change the basic human silhouette. They shape internal physiology, biochemical pathways, or disease resistance, continuing the pattern of subtle inward-focused evolution that began after our outward form stabilized. Real-world demographic data reveals another layer of evolutionary possibility: differential reproduction. In pre-industrial societies, evolutionary pressure strongly favored survival traits. Today, in many regions, evolutionary pressure depends more on reproductive choices, cultural norms, and socioeconomic patterns. As fertility rates drop in industrialized societies and remain higher in others, genetic variation may shift unevenly across the globe. These changes are slow but measurable. Certain alleles associated with earlier puberty, higher fertility, or increased longevity show signs of mild positive selection today. Yet again, these shifts occur internally rather than rewriting the human frame. More speculative but scientifically grounded scenarios explore how future environments may mold the species. In dense urban populations, where billions of people now live, traits that influence social navigation, stress resilience, cognitive multitasking, or adaptability to crowded sensory environments may gradually gain importance. Humans may slowly select for calmer temperaments, greater emotional regulation, or higher tolerance for constant stimulation, traits advantageous in cities vastly different from the landscapes where Homo sapiens first evolved. At the same time, global travel and intermarriage across continents continue the great blending process begun in the late Pleistocene, dissolving genetic boundaries even further and making humanity more interconnected than ever. 1,000 years from now, if trends continue, regional differences may soften even more, shifting humanity toward a more globally blended gene pool. Specific examples from modern medicine also reshape evolutionary futures. Because medical technology allows individuals with genetic conditions that were once life-limiting to survive and reproduce, the genetic landscape of humanity widens rather than narrows. This reduces the intensity of natural selection, but increases genetic diversity, creating a future where evolution proceeds through gentle drift and internal adaptation rather than external pressure. Meanwhile, gene editing technologies like CRISPR introduce an entirely new element: deliberate modification. While still tightly regulated and ethically debated, the mere possibility that future generations may alter their own genetic code suggests an evolutionary trajectory directed not by nature, but by conscious design. Real neurobiological findings hint at possible shifts in cognition. Some populations show signs of selection on genes related to sustained attention, learning efficiency, or cognitive endurance. These are not dramatic changes, but they reflect ongoing adaptation to environments where mental tasks increasingly dominate over physical labor. The rise of digital technology, screens, artificial intelligence, rapid information flow, may introduce new selective environments where memory, adaptability, or even digital multitasking influence reproductive success subtly over the long term. Evolution in such a world becomes less about the body and more about the mind. Listeners may imagine a future family in a high-tech city, or a remote rural community, or a floating settlement designed to withstand rising seas. Their bodies still resemble ours, rounded skulls, balanced limbs, familiar proportions, yet internally they carry adaptations we cannot yet see. Perhaps improved immune resistance, altered metabolism suited to globalized diets, or traits that support life in different climates shaped by technology and climate change. They may process information differently, regulate emotions differently, or adapt to new forms of social connection. And none of this would require a new skeletal form. Evolution may continue unfolding entirely on the inside. Some scientists propose scenarios where humans living in space or on other planets undergo new forms of selection. Bone density changes in low gravity, altered circadian rhythms in artificial habitats, radiation-resistant genetics. But even these changes may remain subtle unless populations become isolated for extremely long periods. As long as gene flow remains global, extreme divergence is unlikely. Humanity's future evolution will not mirror the branching of earlier hominin species unless major new barriers to mixing arise. And yet, the most profound future change may come from the cultural and technological evolution that has always outpaced biology. If artificial intelligence, genetic enhancement, or bioengineering reshape human environments radically, the future human may look much like us physically while experiencing life through senses, cognitive tools, or augmented systems unimaginable today. Evolution might become less biological and more technological, an extension of the same trend that stabilized our bodies tens of thousands of years ago when tools first replaced muscles. Thus, the future of human evolution unfolds as a spectrum of subtle internal shifts, cognitive adaptations, cultural transformations, and, possibly, the first steps toward self-directed evolution. The timeless silhouette remains familiar and steady, while the world around it continues to evolve at extraordinary speed. The mystery of the future, like the mystery of the past, lies not in how our bones will change, but in how our inner world will continue to transform, carrying the species toward horizons our ancestors could not have imagined. As we drift into the final quiet chamber of this long night story, the timeless phase itself comes into focus. not as a moment when evolution stopped, but as a mirror reflecting the deeper truth of what it means to be human. Because when we look back across 50,000 years of unchanging silhouettes, familiar skulls, familiar limbs, familiar faces illuminated by firelight or city glow, we begin to understand that our bodies stopped evolving outwardly, not because nature abandoned us, but because we learned to carry our own evolution inside our minds, our cultures, our communities, and our technologies. Mainstream anthropology shows that by the late Pleistocene, the human form had settled. Rounded cranium, delicate brow, slender frame, long limbs, agile hands. And from that moment onward, humanity's flexibility came not from anatomy, but from imagination, from the ability to reshape environments, invent tools, share knowledge, care for one another, and build societies capable of buffering nearly every selective pressure that once shaped our ancestors. The timeless phase, when viewed gently, becomes less a biological mystery and more a testament to the extraordinary adaptability of the human mind. Important facts from archaeology, paleoanthropology, and genetics trace this entire story like beads on a string. The population bottleneck narrowed our variation but stabilized our form. The expansion of the brain rewired intelligence and creativity long after our skeleton reached its modern outline. Holocene climate calm softened the brutal pressures that once demanded physical change. Tools replaced the need for stronger jaws, thicker bones, or specialized limbs. Diet diversification shifted evolution inward toward metabolism rather than outward toward structure. Migration blurred boundaries and prevented long-term anatomical divergence. Cooperative living protected the vulnerable and allowed many body types to survive. Invisible evolution continued beneath the skin: immunity, digestion, oxygen processing, hormone regulation, while outward anatomy remained stable. Disease sculpted internal defenses, sexual selection refined subtleties of appearance and temperament, and global gene flow dissolved divisions before they could deepen. Finally, technology raced ahead faster than biology could ever follow, buffering our species from harsh environments and carrying the human body forward unchanged. Real events across these tens of thousands of years form a continuous pattern. When Homo habilis first struck stone 2.6 million years ago, physical evolution drove survival. When Homo ergaster learned to run and hunt across the savanna, the body adapted again. When Neanderthals faced cold extremes, their frames thickened, their sinuses widened, their limbs shortened for heat conservation. But once Homo sapiens emerged with abstract thought, symbolic communication, and cultural complexity, the story shifted permanently. Instead of evolving stronger bodies, we evolved stronger strategies. Instead of evolving new bones, we invented new tools. Instead of adapting to environments, we adapted environments to us. Evolution did not end, it changed form. It became cultural, cognitive, technological, still biological at its core, but operating on scales that fossils cannot record. Listeners may imagine in this final quiet moment a line of humans stretching backward through time. The early African hunter gripping a spear, the Ice Age artist painting a lion man on a cave wall, the Neolithic farmer sowing the first fields, the Bronze Age merchant crossing deserts with a caravan, the medieval healer mixing herbs at dusk, the sailor touching distant shores during the Age of Discovery, the factory worker hearing the hum of machines, the modern child waking beneath electric lights, the distant future citizen in a world we cannot yet imagine. Their faces are different, their languages different, their rituals and fears and hopes different, but their bodies, so recognizable, so familiar, are echoes of the same ancient design carried forward with almost no outward change. This continuity is not a failure of evolution. It is its triumph. It is the moment evolution stepped aside and let culture take the lead. More specific genetic insights remind us that even now, beneath our seemingly stable exterior, evolution continues to whisper. New pathogens push immune systems forward, modern diets challenge metabolism, stress patterns reshape hormonal pathways, urban environments subtly reward calmness, adaptability, and social intelligence, and medicine broadens our genetic future, allowing variations once pruned by nature to persist and spread. The timeless phase was never a biological freeze. It was a redirection, a bridge from evolution shaped by nature to evolution shaped by humanity itself. And yet, in this stillness, there is meaning. The fact that our bodies have remained stable for tens of thousands of years reveals something profound about our species, that the human design, once refined, became versatile enough to thrive everywhere, from the Arctic tundra to the Amazon rainforest, from sea level to the Himalayas, from caves to skyscrapers. Our ancestors achieved an evolutionary form so adaptable, so capable, so cognitively empowered that it required no further radical change to survive. And from that moment on, all additional transformation occurred inside us, through imagination, memory, symbolic thought, and the shared languages that stitch human experience together. Listeners may close their eyes and feel the quiet weight of this truth. The timeless phase is not about the body standing still, but about the spirit moving forward. It is a reminder that evolution found its masterpiece not in bone, but in consciousness, not in skull shape, but in story, not in limb proportion, but in community. Our unchanging bodies became vessels for ever-changing worlds, and now, as this story drifts toward rest, the final image softens. Humanity standing at the threshold of its next chapter, not defined by how our bones may change, but by the choices we make, the technologies we shape, the cultures we build, and the care we offer one another. The timeless phase becomes a quiet reassurance that even as the world transforms, the human form carries forward a continuity that binds every era together. We are the same ancient beings who once painted mammoths by torchlight. We are the same minds that once wondered at the stars, and as long as our bodies remain steady, our stories continue, flowing endlessly forward, unbroken.